At the very moment America faces threats abroad and unrest at home, the people entrusted with keeping us safe are being told to do more with less. While the FBI is already stretched thin, the Justice Department's new budget doesn't boost security, it slashes it. And when Glenn Ivey walked into the House Oversight Committee, he wasn't there to play nice, he was there to call it out. The hearing began like many others: statements, questions, polite exchanges, but it didn't stay that way for long. Ivey confronted Attorney General Pam Bondi head-on, accusing her of turning her back on the very principles she once claimed to defend. Tempers flared, interruptions flew, even the clock had to be stopped just to contain the chaos. What made this showdown different wasn't just the politics, it was the timing.
Soda assassin. So that's an area where we can't afford to have those kind of cuts, I don't think, at this time. And the performance of fewer regulatory inspections. I had gun dealers in my district who needed those inspections to take place. And important findings have been made, certainly with respect to tracking crime guns and cracking down on gun dealers who are working illicitly. I'm not saying they all do. I mean, many of them operate in the right way, but the only way to track it down is through inspections that have to be aggressive. And by the way, even under the current regime or the previous regime, I think some of them didn't get inspections for maybe every 10 years or so. So it wasn't like it's a constant harassment piece. But I've got some folks here in the corner of the hearing room who are from my district: Moms Demand Action, DMV Mothers Like Me, Women's Missionary Society. I met with them a few weeks ago, and the concern was the issue of gun violence on our streets and the desire to make sure that the federal presence continues to push hard to make sure we close those cases. You're reducing resources, you're reducing the number of agents, as Mr. Patel said. That's moving in the opposite direction. What response would you give to them with respect to the steps that you're taking to make sure not only that we stay safe, but we get even safer and do even more to get violent offenders off the street and get the guns off the street before the violent offenders get them?
So first, Congressman Ivey, you're a former prosecutor, and I'm smiling because I could see that in some of your questions. Thank you for those questions. I'm going to try to answer them all in order of how you ask them. You ask about the FBI, our budget, and Director Patel clarified that in front of the Senate, I think, and our budget includes $10.1 billion, 12,926 agents for the FBI.
I think clarification would be gentle. It was a complete flip-flop on what he said when he was here.
So
And he was asked 3 times by Ms. DeLauro just to make sure that he was right about what he had said when he was testifying.
They prioritize realignment of personnel to the field to carry out national security, which you just talked about, intelligence, criminal law enforcement, and criminal justice missions.
Can I do this?
Can I just keep, I only have 34 seconds to answer you,
I've got
and I
three
really
quick
want to
questions
answer.
for you, and I'd love
You're
to get...
asking 3 questions and you haven't let me answer one.
I'd love to get your answers in writing. Quick questions.
Nibbin.
When you were the Attorney General in Florida...
Chairman, can I answer the question?
You offered, after the Parkland shooting, I believe this is my time, under the rules, and I had...
Stop the clock.
Can we stop the clock?
Stop the clock at a different.
Let's be respectful of each other.
Mr. Chairman, what I just said was, if you could submit your answers in writing, that would be great. I don't think I've made any kind of statement that's been accusatory with respect to her or her professional reputation. There's been no attack on her. These were just questions that were asked. I'm seeking the answers in writing, which would be great. But I have a couple others that I'd like to ask too, and we'll do them on... No, it hasn't. You cut me off when there were 30 seconds left. Yeah. So... Well, that's true too. A couple of you all went over like a minute and a half.
Over almost 2 minutes.
I just would like my 30 seconds back, and then if she can submit answers in writing, that'll be fine. But I want to get these questions in while she's here.
Go ahead.
I want to ask the questions, and she can submit the answers. This is my 5 minutes. I get to do it the way I want to do it. under the committee rules and under the House rules. These are my 5 minutes. And as I said, I have not been disrespectful to this witness. I have not. Or
I feel like he did.
okay. When you were the Attorney General in Florida, after the Parkland shooting, my understanding is you moved to ban gun sales to people under 21. Is that a position that you would take now as the Attorney General? I have a bill, H.R. 2368, which does something like that. I would be interested in if you'd be willing to co-sponsor or support that bill. You also moved to enact
Only days after a U.S. military strike on Iran, with fears of sleeper cells and domestic threats rising, Bondi was defending cuts to the very agencies tasked with preventing disaster. Ivey didn't just question the numbers, he questioned the judgment. And what happened next turned a routine budget hearing into something far more explosive. The tension was thick from the very first exchange. Ref. Glenn Ivey leaned forward, his voice sharp and unrelenting, as he laid out what he saw as a reckless betrayal of public safety. This wasn't a casual budget disagreement, it was a direct accusation that the Justice Department was putting American lives at risk. Sitting across from him, Attorney General Pam Bondi tried to keep her composure, but every answer she gave seemed to only fuel Ivey's fire. He pressed her on the cuts, thousands of FBI positions left vacant, critical resources pulled off the streets at the very moment threats were multiplying. Ivey called it not just irresponsible but dangerous. When Bondi tried to defend the numbers by pointing back to realignments and staffing priorities, Ivey cut her off. "That's a flip-flop," he declared, reminding everyone that her earlier testimony told a completely different story. The words hung in the chamber like an indictment. The clash escalated fast. Ivey demanded answers in real time. Bondi pushed to provide them in writing. Interruptions rang out as members argued over who controlled the clock. "Stop the clock," one lawmaker shouted, as the hearing spiraled into procedural chaos. But Ivey refused to back down. He insisted this wasn't about partisan games, it was about national security, about the lives of families back in his district and across the country. And as his questions sharpened, it became clear that Bondi's carefully rehearsed talking points wouldn't be enough to shield her from the storm. This was no longer just a budget hearing, it had become a public reckoning. Just beneath the surface of Ivey's fury was a deeper fear, the timing. Only days earlier, a U.S. military strike on Iran had sent shockwaves through the world. Intelligence briefings warned of heightened risks at home. Sleeper cells, retaliatory plots, and domestic terrorism suddenly felt less like distant threats and more like imminent dangers. And yet in this exact moment of rising tension, the Justice Department's budget proposal didn't bolster America's defenses. It cut them. Ivey reminded the chamber that FBI Director Christopher Wray had already raised the alarm. Even before the Iran crisis, Wray said the Bureau was short more than 2,400 agents and billions of dollars in funding. He had asked for reinforcements, warning Congress that attrition and vacancies were leaving critical holes in national security. Instead of meeting those needs, Ivey argued, the budget ignored them, and then went further, slashing hundreds of positions outright. "You're taking FBI agents off the street at the worst possible time," Ivey warned, his voice firm. "There isn't a worse moment to do this." The message was chilling. When the nation needed vigilance, the department was pulling back. Bondi tried to frame the cuts as realignment, a reshuffling of resources rather than abandonment. But Ivey wasn't buying it. He pointed out that sleeper cells don't wait for government reorganization, and terrorists don't pause while agencies shuffle paper. Every agent pulled off the street, every investigation slowed, every vacancy left unfilled was, in his view, an open invitation to those who wanted to harm America. The room grew quiet as his words landed. For Ivey, this wasn't theory, it was a ticking clock, and to him every cut made that clock tick faster. But even that wasn't the most alarming issue on his list. If the loss of FBI agents sounded bad enough, Ivey had another warning locked and loaded. This time it wasn't about manpower, it was about tools. He zeroed in on the NABIN system, the national ballistic database that law enforcement depends on to connect shell casings to guns and track shooters across state lines. In Ivy's view, cutting resources here was nothing short of reckless. He reminded the committee that Enna Bin had been critical in cracking open major cases, including assassination attempts that could have gone unsolved without its rapid matches. The database wasn't just another line item in a budget, it was a lifeline for investigators who needed answers in hours, not weeks. This is how we stop killers before they strike again, Ivy stressed. But the threat didn't stop there. He pointed to ATF inspections of gun dealers, another target of the proposed cuts. Even under past administrations, inspections were infrequent, sometimes once a decade. Now, with even fewer agents on the job, oversight would plummet further. Ivy warned that without regular checks, corrupt or negligent dealers could funnel weapons straight into the hands of criminals, undetected and unchecked. To drive the point home, he invoked his own district, where mothers and community leaders had begged for stronger federal presence to curb the flow of illegal firearms. Groups like Moms Demand Action had sat in his office, pleading for accountability. And now, as Ivy told it, the department was walking away from the very responsibilities that communities relied on. Bondi's defense, that some functions were simply being reallocated, did little to calm the storm. Ivy's voice carried the weight of prosecutors, victims and grassroots advocates all at once. He framed the cuts not as abstract math but as real lives left vulnerable. And then he pulled the confrontation into an even more personal arena, Bondi's own record. Up to this point, Ivy had hammered the numbers, the agents and the tools. But then he changed tactics. Instead of debating budgets, he put Pam Bondi herself on trial. He reminded the room that Bondi wasn't new to these debates. Back when she served as Florida's Attorney General in the aftermath of the Parkland shooting, she had stood shoulder to shoulder with lawmakers calling for reform. She supported raising the minimum age for gun purchases to 21. She praised red flag laws that allowed courts to temporarily seize firearms from people deemed dangerous. At the time, those positions won her headlines as a Republican willing to break ranks and take tough stances in the name of public safety. But now, under the hot lights of Congress, Ivy pressed her to answer whether those convictions still held. He introduced his own bill, H.R. 2368, which echoed the very measures she had once embraced. Would she co-sponsor it? Would she reaffirm the principles she claimed to believe in after Parkland, or would she retreat into silence now that the politics had changed? And then came the kicker, ghost guns. Bondi had never clearly taken a stance on the issue, and Ivy made sure to highlight the silence. Ghost guns, untraceable, unregistered, built from kits, were increasingly showing up at crime scenes. Law enforcement called them a nightmare, and Ivy made it plain, there is no legitimate use for these weapons on our streets. They're designed to help criminals escape justice. Do you support banning them? Bondi hesitated, offering no firm answer. The moment was tense. For Ivy, the contrast was glaring, a public official once praised for decisive action, now unwilling to commit when it mattered most. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. Ivy was painting a portrait of political convenience, a leader who shifted when the spotlight shifted, leaving the public to wonder where her convictions truly stood. And the cracks in Bondi's defense were only beginning to show. By now, Ivy wasn't just questioning Bondi's policies, he was going after her credibility. He called her testimony a flip-flop, a word that instantly cut through the chamber and shifted the hearing's tone from tense to explosive. Bondi bristled, insisting she had been consistent, but the damage was done. Once that label was out there, every answer she gave sounded defensive, every explanation like an excuse. Ivy pressed harder. He accused her of dodging questions, of hiding behind promises to submit answers in writing. To him, that wasn't accountability, it was evasion. The longer she delayed, the more it looked like she had something to avoid saying out loud. The chamber itself began to fracture, members shouted over one another. "Stop the clock," rang out as lawmakers fought to protect Ivy's questioning time. Others jumped in to shield Bondi, claiming Ivy was being too aggressive. The hearing teetered on the edge of chaos, with procedure itself turning into a weapon. But Ivy refused to back down. He pointed out that Bondi once fought for reforms after Parkland, but was now stonewalling even basic questions. He painted the image of a leader who, when pressed, couldn't defend her own record. Bondi tried to regain control, but interruptions and accusations kept her on the defensive. Every second that passed made her position look weaker. To the audience, it didn't feel like a budget discussion anymore. It felt like a courtroom drama, with Ivy as the prosecutor and Bondi in the witness chair, struggling to explain contradictions in her own story. And as Ivy's attacks mounted, the confrontation transformed into something larger than either of them, a fight not just about policies or programs, but about the very integrity of leadership under pressure. The hearing had boiled over, and the fallout was about to get even more devastating. By the time the shouting died down, one thing had become clear: this hearing was no longer just about budget lines, it was about trust. And in Ivy's eyes, the Justice Department, under Bondi's defense, was losing it fast. He framed the issue in stark, undeniable terms. America had just launched strikes abroad, tensions with Iran were rising, and security experts warned of sleeper cells waiting for their chance. Yet here was a budget that didn't add muscle to the FBI or ATF, it cut them. That's moving in the opposite direction, Ivy declared, his voice echoing through the chamber. Bondi tried to reclaim control. She pointed to realignments, to efficiency, to priorities. But Ivy hammered back with specifics: vacant positions, gutted resources, weakened inspections, crippled databases. For him, these weren't bureaucratic shifts, they were cracks in the armor of national security. The contrast was brutal. Ivy stood as the voice of urgency, backed by victims, mothers, and community groups demanding stronger safeguards. Bondi looked cornered, falling back on procedure, promising written answers, and struggling to project confidence. The more she deflected, the more the hearing exposed the gap between her words and the reality Ivy painted. What should have been a routine debate over numbers had morphed into something larger, a test of credibility. Could the Justice Department be trusted to protect Americans when it couldn't even defend its own budget under questioning? The hearing didn't provide closure. If anything, it left the air heavier, filled with doubts. Ivy had pulled the curtain back, and Bondi's defense seemed less like strength and more like survival. And as the session wound down, one last question lingered, unspoken but unavoidable: when national security is on the line, do excuses count for anything? As the gavel finally came down, the hearing chamber was left buzzing with more questions than answers. What began as a budget review had turned into a public spectacle, a clash of conviction versus caution, urgency versus delay. Rep. Glenn Ivy hadn't just highlighted flaws in the Justice Department's numbers, he had exposed a deeper crisis of confidence. To him, the stakes couldn't be clearer. The FBI was already stretched thin. The ATF was already struggling to keep up. Ballistic tracing, gun dealer inspections, ghost guns, all of it required more resources, not fewer. And at the very moment global threats were intensifying, the government's plan was to tighten the belt. Ivy made sure the absurdity of that choice echoed far beyond the hearing room. Pam Bondi, once praised for her willingness to confront gun violence after Parkland, now found herself accused of retreating when it mattered most. Her refusal to commit, her reliance on written responses, and her struggle to reconcile past stances with present silence left the impression of a leader cornered by her own contradictions. But perhaps the most striking part of the exchange wasn't the procedural chaos, the accusations of filibustering, or even the heated interruptions. It was the sense that this wasn't politics as usual. This was about whether the people charged with protecting Americans were prepared, or whether they were hiding behind excuses while vulnerabilities widened. Ivy left the chamber casting himself as a voice for communities demanding safety, for mothers who'd lost children, for neighborhoods tired of gunfire in the night. Bondi left defending a budget that in Ivy's framing did the opposite of what the moment required. So the question remains, when the threats are real and the risks are growing, will leaders rise to the occasion or retreat into talking points? That's not just a question for Pam Bondi, it's a question for every official who holds power in times of crisis, and that's where we'll leave it today. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because the stories coming out of Washington aren't slowing down, and neither are we. Stay sharp, stay loud.